Danger in the Clouds. When the airplane passes overhead, the people are so excited that they all come running down to the harbor. A man over at Green's Lake, a mile away, rides his horse as fast as it will run, down onto the ice. As he stops his horse, it drops dead on the ice. Joe looks at the horse, then to the man as he is getting up from the ice and brushes himself off.
What happened?
I don't know. He must have been scared to death of your airplane.
Dissolve 2, Interior, Charlevoix Cafe, morning. Super, April 14th, 1926. The little cafe is bustling with patrons all excited for the morning special. All the seats are filled with chatting customers. Joe sits at a small table near the window by himself. The remnants of breakfast clutter the tabletop as Joe scribbles a letter.
Dear Mother, I have 2 more trips to make here. We'll finish on Saturday. This is a great little place tucked away from the rest of the world among the pines. Charlevoix is the home reminiscent of the Lobes. There's nothing but wilderness around here's birch and pine forest. Well, have nothing more to say, but we'll say that I probably will be stationed here. I'll see you all Sunday. With love to all, your son Joe.
Dissolve 2, Exterior, Airplane, Day. Super, April 15th, 1926. Joe is loading several packages and bags into the front seat of the airplane as the wind and snow is whipping around. Joe is all set as he buttons down a cover over the front seat protecting the valuable cargo. Joe is soon taxiing down the snowy runway and off into the storm. Cut to Interior, Airplane, later. Joe is bundled up tightly in his sheepskin coat and gloves. He looks frozen as the goggles are iced over. He tries to clean the lens with little success. Exterior. The airplane is tossed around in the 30-knot winds and snow. The wings are icing over heavily as the engine struggles to keep running. Interior. Joe notices the heaviness of the airplane as he fights to keep it in the air. Blinded by the blowing snow, Joe aimlessly continues on across the frozen Lake Michigan. Losing altitude as he goes, Joe is forced to land on the snow-covered ice. Exterior. Suddenly, jagged ice projections are all around and he is fighting desperately to guide his plane in between them and find a leveled area to set down. He weaves between the tall ice pieces sticking up, and after brushing the snow off of some with the wings, Joe sets down on the flat ice and slides around. Bouncing from the rough ice, he manages to get the airplane stopped. Cut 2. Exterior. Frozen Lake Michigan. Moments later. The wind and snow pound on as Joe climbs out with tools in hand. He hammers some stakes into the ice and attempts to tie the airplane as the wind plays havoc and forces the airplane out of control. It slams into the jagged ice formations and damages the right wing. Joe fights the wind, gaining some control. He cinches the ropes and secures the airplane. As he is tying off the tail, the winds force the stakes out of the ice and slams the airplane again into the jagged ice, this time destroying the left wing beyond repair. Joe fights on and anchors all the stakes deeper into the ice. He cinches the ropes so the airplane cannot move again. Joe makes room in the front cockpit and fastens the cover over himself. The storm rages on. Fade 2. Exterior, Frozen Lake Michigan, morning. The airplane sits alone on the ice, covered with a blanket of snow as the sun peeks a ray of hope over the tops of the endless ice formations. The only clear spot for miles shelters the little airplane. Joe's hand inches its way from under the cover. He unfastens the cover and pokes his head up for a look. Miles of diamonds gleam and dance in the morning sun. Joe is mesmerized by the tranquility of the sight. He sits and stares at the landscaping for what seems like an eternity. Cut 2. Exterior. Frozen Lake, Michigan. Moments later. Joe is stuffing his supplies into a backpack. He throws it on his back. Taking the map from the side pocket in the cockpit, Joe checks it against his pocket compass. Looking at the map, he draws a line with his finger from where he took off in the direction he was heading when he landed. Calculating his course, Joe looks off into the distance. He scans the horizon in a left-to-right pattern slowly. He looks at his compass and picks a direction, then steps out to make his way across the desolate, snow-covered ice. Joe soon disappears into the horizon. Fade 2. Exterior, frozen Lake Michigan, day. Joe continues his trek across the frozen waters of Lake Michigan in search of Beaver Island. Referring to his map and compass, Joe forges his way across the new fallen snow. Occasionally, he hears ice cracking beneath his feet. Wolves howl in the distance. Joe stops and listens for a moment, then trudges on. The landscape is desolate, with snow-covered jagged ice formations into the distant horizon. Cut 2. Exterior, frozen lake, Michigan, evening. Joe saunters on as the sun is sitting low on the western horizon. The howling wolves are closer. As Joe continues into the darkness, the wolves follow about a mile behind, sniffing his trail. Cut 2. Exterior, frozen Lake Michigan, night. Pitch black skies filled with brilliant diamonds. The ice gives off a luminescent glow. Joe hears the wolves very close. They run past him, almost knocking him down. Joe yells at them. He marches on at a quicker pace. The wolves follow and run circles around him. Fade 2. Exterior, frozen Lake Michigan, morning. The winds have started whipping around in the early onset of morning. Cold and alone except for a pack of hungry wolves, Joe, exhausted from the long trek across the ice and snow, staggers relentlessly as the wolves run up and nip at his heels. He tries to fight them off, but they dash out of his reach. Joe struggles aimlessly to continue on. Joe looks up and spies an island poking up from the ice. He gets a spurt of energy and picks up the pace as best he can. As Joe reaches the bank, the ice is thin and Joe falls through to his waist. The wolves back off. Joe breaks the ice in front of him and waddles up on the shore and darts into the brush, leaving the wolves behind, staring. Joe pushes his way through the brush and discovers an old log cabin. He seeks shelter inside. Cut 2. Interior, Garden Island cabin, continuous. A potbelly stove sits against the wall. Joe builds a fire in the stove and hangs his clothes on a makeshift rack. He takes a can of beans from his pack and opens them with his pocket knife, places the can on the stove and lays back on the bed. He dozes off for a few minutes as the beans start to boil. Cut 2. Interior, Garden Island cabin, later. Joe sits at the dilapidated table eating the beans as he looks over the map, trying to decide where he is as he traces the line across the map from Charlevoix to Beaver Island. He taps on the map at Garden Island and nods his head in agreement. Finishing up the can of beans, he gathers up his belongings, puts his clothes on, and makes his way back outside. Cut 2. Exterior, Garden Island cabin, continuous. Joe plots his course, checks his compass, and starts off to find Beaver Island. He makes his way down to the shore in a different direction from whence he came. Finding the ice in better condition, Joe makes his way back out onto the lake. Cut 2. Exterior, frozen Lake Michigan, later. In the distance, he can see the next island. He makes his way to the shoreline and finds a safe passage onto land. Joe checks his map and locates Hog Island. The silence is broken by the distant barking of several dogs. Joe runs in the direction of the barking. As he breaks out of the snowy brush, he spies 2 dog-sled teams making their way across the island. Joe yells and waves his arms in the air. Cut 2. Exterior, Hog Island, later. Joe is sitting in the sled with a heavy blanket over him, drinking hot coffee from a tin cup as the teams are racing across the island and back out onto the ice. Cut 2. Exterior, frozen Lake Michigan, night. The dog sleds have run all night across the frozen lake, and the lights of civilization are flickering in the distance. They push on for what seems timeless. Eventually reaching the mainland, the dog sleds arrive on the beach as the townspeople gather around.
Did you find him?
Is that the pilot?
Is he alive?
Yes, we found him. He's all right.
Cut 2. Exterior, Charlevoix Cafe, night. A crowd has pushed their way into the diner, and all try to get closer to Joe. He is shaking hands with several people and thanking them for rescuing him. Fade 2. Exterior, Charlevoix Airport, morning. Joe is loading packages and supplies into the front seat of his new de Havilland DH-4 biplane. He finishes up and sets the controls to start the engine, gives the propeller a spin, and the big engine fires up. Joe pulls the blocks from the wheels and climbs in. In moments, he is roaring into the skies. Cut 2. Exterior, airplane, later. Joe is looking over the instruments, and gazing around at the frozen landscape below. He is out over Lake Michigan, nearing Beaver Island. As Joe reaches the harbor, he can see water below. Joe circles the bay and looks for some place to land. The ice is still intact outside of the buoy markers. He sets the biplane down on the ice and slush. Cut to, exterior, Beaver Island Harbor, later. A fishing tug chugs out of the harbor towards the ice patch that Joe is sitting on. Joe is dragging the bags of mail to the edge as the boat inches up. Joe hands up the bags one at a time to Mike Cull.
Glad you were able to make it, Joe.